Welcome to the latest edition of the Cranky Curmudgeon's Corner. My name is Paul Thomas, and this evening we are going to be talking about sedition. After the January 6th rioters left the Capitol, the joint session of Congress reconvened to perform the constitutionally mandated task of counting the electoral votes and certifying Joe Biden as the winner of the election. That process saw 147 Republican senators and representatives vote against certifying Pennsylvania and Arizona for Biden. I couldn't find any statute addressing this issue as a violation of law, but am I wrong to conclude that this vote is essentially a violation of democracy? They did not care that a majority of voters in Pennsylvania and Arizona chose Biden and not Trump. Do these votes indicate something other than their opposition to a peaceful transfer of power and support for sedition? Judy?
Well, I don't know if we're going to be able to charge them with sedition, but there are many people now referring to what they did as a violation of democratic principles, which I think it certainly is. And, you know, their job was ceremonial. And they were supposed to count the electoral votes that had already been certified by the states. And while I suppose they could raise objections, it just seems like it's a violation of their oath of office, which is an oath to uphold the Constitution, to do what they did.
So you feel they violated the Constitution then?
That's a really hard one. I mean, the Constitution, I suppose, gives us a little leeway there, but it's a violation of some sort of principles that we like to think we adhere to, and they didn't.
Okay, Thaddeus, did that vote represent a support for the sedition attempt that took place hours before?
The best legal minds in the country are still struggling to sort this one out. But when I thought about what they did, ultimately their official act in the last part of that session of Congress was to cast a vote. And of course, the Constitution says that they are supposed to cast a vote. It doesn't say necessarily whether they're going to vote for or against or for one person or the other. It just says that their job is to cast a vote. And doing so is a political act rather than a legal act. They were not casting a judgment on anyone in that case. They weren't sitting in court. They were politicians doing politics, as they usually do as legislators. They vote for or against things. In light of that, we have to acknowledge that the people of Arizona and Pennsylvania have been wronged by having their votes ignored by their representatives. But what the representatives did was a political act, and the retribution that they deserve for that political act is to have the voters replace them at the earliest opportunity. And I feel sure that some of the voters, at least in Arizona and Pennsylvania, are going to be replacing those guys. But that's what it is. You know, they've done politics, so they have a political price to pay by not getting reelected. Unfortunately, we are American voters, and we are notoriously sloppy on memory work. So, you know, it's a toss-up or a knock wood whether those voters are going to remember in November of next year what they need to remember.
Yeah, I think a lot of those 147 votes came from safe districts,
Yeah.
that have been gerrymandered to be quite safe for those, and that's why they did. More worried about being primary.
Yeah.
Jerry, just remember, it's not a lie if you believe it.
Okay, the big lie that the election was stolen from Trump resulted in Trump's attempt to actually steal it from 81 million American voters through lawsuits and violent insurrection. The big lie is also prompting Republican-led state legislatures to enact laws designed to make it harder to vote in future elections than it was in 2020. These Republican bills in 47 state houses, do they qualify in your mind as seditious related activity? That is voter suppression. That's what we're talking about here. Would you call that seditiously related activity?
I wish I could, because it would be a whole lot easier to prosecute if we could just say, it's seditious to do this. What they are doing is taking advantage of the fact that the Supreme Court dismantled the Voting Rights Act of 1964. We had a Jim Crow era with laws like this. And I think we talked about this at an earlier date. The Supreme Court came out a little while, and the big easy that they gave these states was to say, well, you don't have to have your new voter regulations federally approved before you put them in. That's thank you to the Roberts Court. If the Voting Rights Act had remained intact, we wouldn't have this problem.
They wouldn't even be trying to pass these bills if Roberts hadn't gutted the Voting Rights Act.
I think that was a mistake that I just can't understand anybody as intelligent as Mr. Roberts could have made. After all, the simile that was put forth for that was that if you have a person who is taking antipsychotic drugs and he has not had a psychotic break in a long time, it's an indication that the antipsychotic drugs are working. But it's also a temptation for the patient to say, hey, I'm feeling fine. I don't really need to take these pills. And he doesn't take them, and he goes out and kills somebody. That's basically what these states are doing. They took away the antipsychotic drugs of the Voting Rights Act because there hadn't been any instances of that since 1964. So since the people were obeying the law, somebody said, we don't need the law again. But the people who were saying we don't need the law anymore were the people who specifically wanted to break that law. So they petitioned the Supreme Court to overturn it. And the Supreme Court, like sheep, overturned it. And they were already fashioning some of these anti-voter laws before the ink was dry on the Supreme Court's decision. And that's, that opened Pandora's box as far as voting rights is concerned.
And right now, the Heritage Foundation is very involved in crafting these 47 state houses, the laws of voter suppression. They had a woman on TV give a presentation as to how the Heritage Foundation was going ahead with their model framework on which these laws could be set up. Judy, did I go too far in calling this this thing happening in the state house as sedition?
Well, I think that is onto something when he, what he's referring to actually is what the courts always refer to as a political question, something that the court's not going to touch with a 10-foot pole. I want to point out that Roberts not only was involved in this Voting Rights Act case, he also was involved in Citizens United. And I don't happen to think that he is not smart enough to know what he's doing, which perhaps makes it worse. And then the other thing is that the Voting Rights Act applied to a selected number of basically southern states. And what's going on now is happening all over. But it didn't start with the repeal of the Voting Rights Act either. That made it worse, don't get me wrong. And it would be great if someone could look at what the states are doing and if there were a commission to check on what they're doing. But it started before that. And I think that probably I've told you guys this before, but Indiana passed the first voter ID law in the country. And that's the start of this. Voter ID, it's all a part of voter suppression. And that was appealed to the Seventh Circuit, which upheld it, though I'm proud to say the judge I worked for dissented and said all of these things way back in the 70s, that this is just a way of suppressing votes and increasing Republican votes and suppressing Democratic votes. It was appealed to the Supreme Court, which of course upheld it. The Indiana law is still in effect, I believe. I guess I haven't checked in the last few minutes. But also much later, both a prominent judge on the Seventh Circuit, Richard Posner, who had written the decision in the Seventh Circuit case upholding the Indiana law, said he was wrong. And Justice Stevens on the Supreme Court didn't quite say he was wrong, but regretted that decision. So this whole voter suppression thing has, it's now a wildfire, but it started a long time ago.
But you're right. A long time ago. Voting Rights Act was enacted, I think, in 1965. And by 1970, they were already working to undermine it.
Right.
There is currently a war in the Republican Party between a couple of members led by Liz Cheney, who was just ousted by voice vote from her leadership position for committing the unforgivable crime of telling the truth, and all the rest whose policy agenda is to support the lie that Trump won in 2020. We have congressional elections in 2022, 2024, and in 2026. Take a look into your crystal ball and articulate how you think this strategy, now clearly embraced by Republican office holders, the strategy of the lie, the big lie, will play out in both primary and general election upcoming elections. Judy, how do you think it's going to work out in the primaries and then in general?
Well, the primaries might go bad, almost certainly will. But
what do you mean by bad?
Well, the more and more conservative candidates are likely to win Republican primaries.
Trump's candidates?
Yeah.
Okay.
But maybe not, because part of me says this is so obvious and so blatantly a power grab by people who really have no policy agenda. All they want is power to do what? Protect themselves, that maybe more sane Republican voters, suburban voters, soccer moms, whoever you want to call them, will end up rejecting those candidates. So I try to be optimistic. And also, all of the voter suppression attempts, I hope, will do what I kind of think they did in Georgia, and that is make people come out, or in Wisconsin, stand in the rain for hours in order to vote because, damn it, you can't do this to me. So I am hoping that we get some of that backlash. That's my optimistic hope.
Your optimism comes from your view that the general election will have more sensible people go to vote because they're very much afraid as to the direction that we're heading.
Yeah, I do. And I think that, well, I guess that's just something I am clinging to. I don't know if it's realistic or not.
Thaddeus, how realistic is Judy's clinging?
I think that we're reading each other's minds here. I think, as she does, that the 2022 primaries, at least, things can change later on, but the 2022 primaries, we're going to see Republicans worshiping their incumbents, worshiping their Trump advocates. And unfortunately, I'm afraid that Liz Cheney's walking the plank last week is going to be long forgotten by then. But that's a worst case scenario. On the other hand, the GOP strategies and many GOP strategies for getting rid of Democratic or would-be Democratic voters have become so obviously misanthropic that, we have had reports in recent weeks of a small but steady stream of exodus from the GOP. We got another year and a half. If it continues that way, that the people in the voters in the GOP get fed up with what their party people are doing, because, as Judy said, it's not about governance, it's about power for me. So they might find that they're, maybe, I've been saying for 40 years that the GOP has been overplaying its hand over and over again, but people going to say, okay, well, maybe they have finally overplayed their hand to the point at which the voters vote with their feet and get out of the party. And at that point, maybe the majority will actually win some elections in the general. But it's a knockwood situation.
For sure.
Well, it's nice to have optimism here.
Otherwise, we just despair.
Well, I'm back to I'm down to the last question here, which is kind of a despairing narrative. So let me just go and bring you all down from the high that you put us on this second here. Last question. I am becoming increasingly concerned about our descent into a totalitarian fascist police state. The Republicans in Congress are dead set against voting rights. Republicans in state houses are rapidly passing Jim Crow voter suppression legislation. The Roberts Court, which, as you mentioned earlier, gutted the protections of the 1965 voting rights law in 2013, now has Gorsuch, Kavanaugh, and Amy Coney Island Barrett sitting in the room. Police killing unarmed African Americans are working in conjunction with their departments and the district attorney's offices to cover ups, preventing any public scrutiny of these murders. The two-party system has one of the two major parties with most of its registered members believing that January 6th was a bunch of patriots trying to save the country. I'm afraid that a Republican midterm victory in 2022 spells the end of the experiment initiated in 1787. How concerned are you about the future of American democracy? That is.
I would like to orchestrate this question with a lot of French horns and rolling kettle drums tolling an ominous, bleak theme.
That's because you're a musician. So
Yeah. Well, and I agree this, if the GOP cleans up in 2022, the United States as we know it is toast, though some folks might not notice it for 4 or 5 years. Self-government hasn't got a chance. But I have hopes that some of these issues, at least some, all of which are being addressed by the Democratic Congress and the Democratic President, could change. I can't say all of them are going to change, but if some of them do change, we might have some daylight. Now, a clear majority of the voters oppose a lot of what the GOP is doing. As I said, some are already voting with their feet and making the GOP a smaller minority than it was before. I'd be a lot more sanguine about our future as a nation if the Democratic leaders in the Senate, with the not there yet support of President Biden, would finally ditch the filibuster, and they might get a few things done. I hate doing something that radical, but it seems like we're up against a radical enemy in the Senate. Now, a lot of wrongdoings, including those of the most recently alleged president, look like they're headed to court. And the investigators, at least, seem loath to take prisoners, but anxious to make some. I have hopes for that. It's all up in the air, but I'm holding out hopes that we will still be viable as a democratic nation by the end of next year. Fingers, toes, legs, eyes crossed, but not the limits of civil discourse. The other guys have already done enough of that. Thank you.
Well, we do outnumber them.
Yes, we do.
Been clear in many recent elections. I'd say all the way to the 1880 or the 1980s, we have outnumbered them.
Mhm.
But Judy, how concerned are you about the future of our democratic society?
Well, Thad just made me want to go lie down. I am concerned about it. I find it almost hard to contemplate. And what I find hard to understand is, what if these Republicans, Trump followers, won, got a majority in both houses of Congress? Of course, President Biden would then be able to get nothing done at all. But what kind of people are they? What kind of person is Mitch McConnell, that his whole thing for the last 12 years or more has just been to thwart anything happening? I mean, if they had absolute power, would they suddenly have a pang of conscience and think, oh my gosh, if we continue on this path, what are we going to do to this country? I mean, I don't have much hope for that, but I don't understand people who don't feel that way. And, much as Liz Cheney would probably like us to be in every war, and Lisa Murkowski wants us to drill oil in every corner of Alaska, People like that show that some Republicans, and Murkowski's always been pretty moderate, but Cheney hasn't, that some Republicans deep somewhere in their souls have consciences. I don't know. Maybe I'm clinging again, as you can see.
Well, we're all clinging. We're clinging to the hope that the Republicans don't end up destroying the country that they seem hell-bent on destroying.
Yeah, and to what end? That's what I don't understand. To what end?
Yes,
Well,
that's the question. They seem to want power. They want to be the only party in power, and probably, if they can do it, the only party in power forever. But they're not saying anything about how they would like to govern. They're just saying, we're just not going to do it the way you damn Democrats are doing it.
which
Yeah.
has worked pretty well as far as a strategy.
Yeah.
So
It's a strategy, but when you're confronted with bridges falling down and roads that don't work and any number of other things that are, well, people starving to death in the streets more than they already are, then what you almost need a policy, no matter who you are.
well, I think that the goal is to stay in power just because they like being powerful, and any other thing that would come from that is completely inconsequential. I don't have any other explanation than that. What was Trump's policy? Trump's policy was to be mean to everybody he could.
But he couldn't, as bad as he was, and he was bad, he could not bring down the whole system by himself. But what if they got to the point where they could? Would they suddenly wake up and see a responsibility to other people? Right, you're not paying many taxes anymore, you rich guys, but do you feel safe in this country with millions of people roaming the streets, starving to death? I mean, I am dystopian now, and I'll be quiet for a minute.
Well, no, I think you're bringing up a good point, and my answer to that is, if they haven't seen anything about what's coming yet, they're never going to, or never going to try to do anything. And you're talking about their conscience, their altruism, their desire for a decent future. None of that matters, because all they care about is maintaining the power that they have because they like being powerful. Thaddeus, I'm going to let you have the last word on that.
It sort of reminds me of, the idea of a guy who doesn't know how to drive, just moving heaven and earth to get himself a new Cadillac.
Yeah.
And when he gets it, he won't be able to do anything with it, but he'll have it. Well, that happens in finance too. I mean, we have a bunch of, the people who are really in power are the billionaires, and they have more money than they could possibly use, but they're still scraping to get more and more and more money. They want something just for the sake of having it. And that is our wonderful Republican Party. They want to have all the power, and they probably have no idea what they would do with it if they have it. So I hope they don't get it.
Yeah, you and me both, buddy. Hey, I want to thank Judy and Thaddeus for joining us this evening with this very enlightened discussion on sedition. So that's it for this session of the Cranky Curmudgeon's Corner. See you next time. Bye.